Nir.
Well, I like the Rubik's Cube analogy. I've used maybe a similar one that the region is like an ecosystem, and I've written that that ecosystem was hit by an asteroid in 2003, which was the American invasion, which, much like the one that killed the dinosaurs, changed the entire evolution of the region, created new identities, and destroyed old ones. And we're still feeling that. And I think every day in my work in the Middle East, I encounter the ramifications of that. We can tie the election of Trump, the refugee crisis, in Europe, the rise of the right, obviously ISIS, so many things that happen not just in the Middle East, but even in the West, are consequences of that invasion. So I'm in the Future of War conference, but I think the future doesn't have to be war. It can be more peaceful. Part of the problem is that in the Middle East is that Washington is addicted to war in the Middle East. I'm not going to look at the entire Middle East, just the few places I work. I'll start with Iraq. For the first time now in Iraq, there's no force, internal or external, that's trying to overthrow the government, for the first time since 2003. Sunni communities that used to protect or shelter insurgents no longer do that now. Instead, they cooperate with security forces. From Fallujah to Mosul to elsewhere, we see the very same communities that used to shelter insurgents or Al-Qaeda or ISIS now wanting to kill not just those insurgents, but even their families, taking it to the other extreme. In my view, the Sunni-Shia war in Iraq is over. There's no longer any support for a Sunni radical Islamist movement. And otherwise, very depressing Middle East, Iraq is the only place where I find hope in. If you can disregard the last 15 years of horror, Iraq is the only democracy in the Middle East. All actors, from former Sunni hardliners to the most ideologically hardline Shia paramilitary forces, accept the new political order, accept elections and democracy, and believe that that's a legitimate way of attaining power, and are no longer trying to overthrow the government in any other way. There's a consensus. There's a belief that consensus and power sharing are essential elements of the process. Again, from former Sunni hardliners to Shia hardliners, everybody in Iraq tends to believe that. Unlike in the past, now with the election season in Iraq, we don't see sectarian incitement or incitement to violence. We see increasing cross-sectarian and cross-ethnic cooperation. The good news is everybody in Iraq is divided. I was at the US Embassy in Baghdad like 6 months ago, and somebody asked me, how can you reunite the Sunnis? I said, that's the last thing that you want to do. You want people to be divided. You don't want sectarian or ethnic blocs emerging. You don't want Iraq to be like Lebanon. You want to see more cooperation across sectarian and ethnic lines, and we see that emerging in Iraq. And this is what Iraqis call the blessings of ISIS, which is a shocking word to Westerners, but it's commonly used in Iraq. It forced all actors to change their calculus, and we see much more cooperation and acceptance of the state as a result of that trauma of ISIS. Now, there are reports of an ISIS presence between Diyala and Salahuddin. They're kind of being left alone for now for political reasons, but ISIS can't come back. I don't believe in ISIS 2.0. At most, we'll see remote attacks, checkpoints, the occasional car bomb, but no seizure of territory. So Iraq is likely in a path to greater stability. There's very few actors who want to undermine that stability, like I said. The Saudis with their, and maybe some Americans with their paranoia about Iran can still do some damage. Masoud Barzani still wants to divide Iraq, but his ability to do so has been limited. One of the challenges we'll see is that Iraqi actors, other political actors, have to compromise with Barzani in terms of the elections because they can't rely on the PUK and Soleimania. And so they're going to have to ally with him, but he wants to divide Iraq. So there's some seeds of problems, but no major instability. You have pockets of ISIS, as I said, between Diyala, Hawija, Kirkuk, villages like Adaim, Hamrin, Bukhriz, Mtaybija, Zaytun, pretty remote areas. The road from Diyala to Kirkuk. Iraqi observers, often blame Barzani, the KDP, and they call these guys jokingly the Daesh Merga, so combining Peshmerga with Daesh. Rightly or wrongly, that they say that this phenomenon is a result of KDP neglect or KDP provocations. I have no evidence for that. At the moment, my view is that the PMF could finish these guys in an instant if they wanted to, but they kind of want a reminder of why they exist. It benefits certain political actors in Iraq to have a residual ISIS there to kind of scare people, remind people of who saved them from ISIS. in their view, the PMF factors, and also make Abadi look weak in terms of the elections. But anyway, this ISIS presence is not very threatening to the general order. We won't see a return of the insurgency in Anbar. There's some desert area between Fallujah and Mosul that's still a bit insecure, but it could be highway robbery. We have 3,000 Sunni candidates participating in the elections. They'll get between 85 to 100 seats, perhaps. As I said, even former hardliners who supported the insurgency and are tied to the rise of ISIS in 2013 and welcomed ISIS initially are now participating in the elections and the political process. I am a bit concerned about Saudi intervention and meddling, but at least the Saudis have accepted the new Iraq. And that's one of the things I'm most pleased to see. The entire region has finally accepted Iraq from Turkey to Saudi Arabia. They're cooperating with the new government. I am concerned there's this paranoia in Washington. If Abadi doesn't become the next prime minister, oh my God, Iran won. We lost Iraq to Iran. There's a focus on Abadi as the only option, and therefore, if it's some other candidate, you may see the anti-Iran hawks in Washington overreacting. The role of Iran will be reduced as states stabilize. I mean, Iran intervened to support central states in Iraq and Syria to help them restore sovereignty over their territory. Moving on to Syria, while in Iraq the international community assists the return of the state, in Syria we oppose the return of the state. So the return of the state in Iraq means more international support, more stability, and the more you have the state returning, the less you have ISIS. Also, the more you have the state returning in Iraq and Syria, the less you have Russia and Iran, of course. While ISIS 2.0 is unlikely to occur in Iraq and Syria, obviously in Iraq, with the return of the state plus the international assistance, the necessary steps are being taken. But in Syria, that's not being taken, but we don't see a political vacuum because we see non-state governance emerging in certain areas with international support and with a strong capacity to control the population. So the Syrian government is directly or indirectly taking control over much of the country, either through military victories or through so-called reconciliations. It'll retake the remaining pockets in northern Homs in the south, but we also see these emerging Turkish and American zones where you have this non-state kind of governance. Now, the U.S. could have declared victory in Syria when it helped defeat ISIS, and it could have left. Instead, the Trump administration made itself into a spoiler and decided we're not going to leave, we're going to stay and act like a small country, not like a great power, because we don't want Iran and Russia to win, which means it's kind of an indefinite presence, and it prevents a normalization of life in Syria. We don't know what American policy is. The U.S. may or may not stay in its bases throughout the Northeast. If it does stay, then the Syrian PKK, known as the PYD, is going to grow more dependent on the U.S. and less integrated into the region, which places the Kurds of Syria in a very long-term danger, because at some point the U.S. is going to leave, and the Turks or other actors just can't wait to get their hands on them. What the U.S. could be doing is encouraging the integration of the Kurds into the rest of Syria, which would reassure Turkey and prevent the eventual attack on the Kurds, which will otherwise take place. In the northwest, we have an emerging stability with this long-term Turkish occupation of northern Syria, and the implication that the Turks are going to be responsible for taking care of Nusra, now known as HTS, and taking care of the foreign jihadis that are now in this Turkish colony that's being created. The Russians aren't going to do anything about this Turkish colony because they prioritize their relationship with Turkey. They know that they can't lose Syria no matter what, so neither, as we saw with Afrin, the Russians are placing a high emphasis on maintaining the relationship with Turkey. Iran, Hezbollah don't mind this either because at least somebody is in charge of this sort of Al-Qaeda zone in northern Syria. So it appears like the Turks may end up occupying this area in the long term, much like Israel has this long-term occupation over the Golan Heights. So we'll see emerging from this area the occasional Al-Qaeda attack on checkpoints, that kind of thing, but it appears to be quite stable. It's actually a free trade zone between Turkey and Syria. So everybody has an economic interest in maintaining this zone stable, including HTS or Nusra, because economically they all need this to succeed. So Syria is going to be divided into three, unless Trump is sincere about his urge to leave. Nobody really knows. And we'll see a direct role for foreign forces in the midterm, US and Turkey, and they're embedded into the military structures in these two zones, preventing the government of Syria or the Russians from taking them.
Okay, I'll stop you there.
Right.
I want to pick up on the, ISIS 2.0 or not. It's very difficult to pick up a magazine in town here without seeing something about ISIS 2.0. It's become kind of the next cottage industry. Dave, you seem to think that's a thing with the International and the affiliates. Of course, if we follow your analogy, the International didn't do so well after the main territorial base in the Soviet Union collapsed. Why do you disagree with Nir? Why will there be this 2.0?
So I'm interested in his detailed view, but I'm not 100% sure we really disagree, right? Because the point that I made was that whether you think it's post-ISIS or not depends on what you mean by ISIS. And I think if we're talking about the territorial caliphate that controlled cities and drove around in T-55s and all that in Iraq and Syria, that's not coming back. I don't think we're going to see the re-emergence of that, where it sort of lives on after the death of the caliphate. I also really like Nir's ecological analogy. Two people that you should read if you haven't are Rafe Sagarin, who's unfortunately dead now, and Dominic Johnson from the UK, who've both written about the mathematical application of Darwinian evolutionary theory to insurgent groups. And there's actually fairly good evidence to suggest that natural selection processes work on a population of insurgents, much like they do on any other population. And in this case, there's also artificial selection because we're picking people and whacking them, and that's having an improving effect on the population that we're dealing with. The stupid and the unlucky don't make it, and the guys that survive to the next round are the better guys. And what we've done here, and in particular, if we pull out of Syria too early, will be like taking antibiotics and then stopping the course before you're finished, and you end up with a drug-resistant strain that comes back stronger than ever. So will they run around with tanks and control cities? I don't think so, but I don't think they're gone. And I wouldn't say it's ISIS 2.0, it's about ISIS 5 or 6 now at this point.
Yes. So we don't disagree, it won't be ISIS, because ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. That's dead. However, certainly the Islamic State in Cameroon, Mali, Algeria, Afghanistan, it may not seize vast amount of territory, but we're likely to see violence inspired by that for a long time. But the reason why there won't be an ISIS 2.0 in Syria and Iraq, it requires understanding what led to the rise of ISIS in the first place. It wasn't just Maliki's a bad guy, he's oppressing Sunnis, Sunnis get angry, they join ISIS. This is a caricature that's very commonly seen here in DC. First of all, in the Maliki days, it was quite mixed. In Anbar, you didn't see Shia forces. You saw the economy was doing great in 2012. You saw 6 ministers, I think, from Anbar in Maliki's government. They didn't have any legitimate grievances against the government that any other Iraqi wouldn't have. In Mosul, the relationship with the Iraqi army was very tense, and it was quite different. But there was something happening in the region in 2012 and 13 which led to the rise of ISIS. It was a perfect storm. In that you had this phenomenon wrongly called the Arab Spring, but these Arab uprisings taking on a Sunni sectarian element in certain countries, and it gave the defeated insurgency in Iraq the hope that Dixie will rise again, so to speak. And much for the same reason that many Trump voters were unhappy with having a black president in the US. And that was one of their main motivations, perhaps. You saw a similar phenomenon in Iraq. Some people just refused to accept that there could be a Shia leader in Iraq. And I think in Anbar, that may have been the case. And there was a move, Syria is going to fall to a Sunni insurgency, and we can perhaps undo this historical injustice of having a Shia leadership, government imposed on us in Iraq. And you had support coming in from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to various actors in Iraq, but most importantly was the porous Turkish-Syrian border. There wouldn't have been an ISIS 1.0 were it not for the Turkish-Syrian border, where you had thousands of foreign fighters coming in, seizing control of this area, which the US is very much implicated in creating, this failed state zone. You're receiving support from jihadists around the world, and basically invading Iraq and seizing control of much of Iraq through this failed state that had been created in Syria. So now you have the region is entirely against these days this kind of phenomenon. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are competing to see who is more anti-terrorist these days. There's nobody supporting internally or externally this kind of Sunni extremist language. their move is towards restoring state sovereignty. The experience of ISIS was so brutal for most of the people living under its control that we now see them wanting revenge, whether in the Kurdish-held areas of northeastern Syria or in Anbar or Nineveh. People want revenge against families of ISIS guys even. There's been a real backlash against it. So this is again part of that so-called blessings of ISIS that I referred to.
Right. I think with that we'll go to the audience. We're almost out of time.
I really had to sort of puzzle over the Turkey, Russia, Iran axis concept. It's really quite something to really think about because historically speaking, you know, these types of axes, what they usually lead up to is a much more embroiled state for the entire world. So I want to ask the question, actually, you provoked this thought in me, Dave. You know, is it an axis in which it could be operable if it's Erdogan's Turkey, or is it anybody's Turkey that access needs to sort of be, to have it sort of be in play? Do you know what I mean? Like, essentially, the one difference between, you know, Russia and Iran, those are fairly stable authoritarian states. Erdogan may or may not stay forever, and certainly there's a little bit more flexibility in the system there. So I wonder whether or not that access power would hold long term.
I think that's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to it. I mean, I think obviously Turkey now is a very different country in some ways than it was before the coup attempt. But in other ways, it's still very similar, and it still has the same geopolitical interests in the region that it had in 2015 when it was trying to achieve a rather similar territorial buffer to what we're seeing now. So my current impression is that this axis that we're seeing emerge is really around the Astana process. That's why I call it the Astana axis. It's about coming to a political resolution of the conflict in Syria, and maybe, depending on what we think is going to happen with that, it will either hold together or break apart once that reaches some kind of resolution. So I think I'm sort of taking a watching brief at the moment on where that's going. I think it has really significant geopolitical implications for the region, as I said. It also has some pretty major military implications for NATO and others. But I'm not sure it's necessarily a threatening development in itself. It's just that it's like the rise of Kurdistan. It changes a lot of things that we sort of took for granted and causes things to realign. Yeah. So short answer is I don't know.
Maybe just a brief comment on that. From a regional point of view, this, not from an American point of view perhaps, this is a positive development. These are countries of the region cooperating to tackle common threats. Now, Turkey's policy changed, but Turkey was contributing for a long time to instability, for several years at least, 2011 to 2015 maybe. But now we see Turkey, Russia, and Iran cooperating in favor of stability, and in a sense to counter some of the American blunders which have led to greater instability. You could include supporting the PKK in the absence of a larger strategy as part of that, which is obviously very alarming to Turkey, destabilizing the state in Syria, leading to the rise of ISIS and other actors of great concern to Russia and Iran. So we may not like these actors, but they're acting, these are local actors acting to provide a local stability in areas where the US only has a limited and perhaps temporary interest.
Great. One more quick question. Yeah, David, right here.